Megan, thank you so much for joining us today on the What is a Good Life podcast. As I've just mentioned to you there, since discovering your work and just around some really gorgeous themes like spaciousness and all that entails, I'm really intrigued to see where this conversation goes today.
Yeah, lovely to be with you here, Mark.
So, as you're aware, I begin this with: is there a question you're exploring as you move through life?
I'm smiling because I think the main question in my mind right at this present moment is, can I possibly mother two teenage daughters in any way successfully and stay sane? But if you're looking at a question that is slightly longer term, uh, I think for about 25 years, I have been exploring, I guess, an ontological question. How do I encounter the world and others around me? How do I see my relationship with the world and others around me? And I'm especially interested in when I become particularly sort of self interested and self focused, and when I see myself as separate to the things that are around me, when I see the world as somewhat instrumental and I get all anxious. There's that sort of mode of encountering the world, and there's another mode of encountering the world where I feel very connected, where I see flow, where I see interrelationships, interdependencies. My focus of attention is not on me. It's on what's going on out there. And I'd quite like a bit more of that side of things, really. So, a question that I've had even before I did my doctorate, which focused a lot on this, is yeah, how do I encounter the world with a particular interest in what you might call flow experiences, especially with other people? You know, what's that about? How does that work? What's going on there? And how do I suppose, how do I initiate that a little bit more?
I love the present question, going parallel with this longer inquiry as well. I don't know. There's something kind of quite delicious about the human experience, that it can hold both such questions maybe simultaneously.
Absolutely, and that they are kind of related as well, I think. You know, how I'm dealing with my current, mothering, questions is probably in to some degree relating to the larger question.
Yeah, absolutely. Just in terms of that larger question of how do I encounter the world, when did that first kind of come into view for you? Like, when did that start to seem significant or important?
I suppose probably way, way back when I finished university and I didn't know what I was gonna do and decided to go backpacking for a very long time. And did the obligatory exploration of various spiritual endeavors around the world, and so started to ask slightly more philosophical questions. um, and then when I think about 25 years ago, I began a master's in change skills and strategies, and had to choose a dissertation, and I chose something that I then labeled empathic resonance in coaching relationships. So I was really interested in flow situations, real deep connections between people, particularly in coaching. And so I think that's where I started to explore it a little bit more academically. And then a few years later, I began a doctorate, and I was interested still in this empathic resonance. I was particularly interested in its role or its experience within leadership relations. And that led me into the whole world of dialogue. And in particular, it led me to Martin Buber's work on I, thou, and I, it. And those are Martin Buber being probably one of the sort of founding fathers, I suppose, in dialogue and philosophy. And he examined how we encounter the world in two different ways. And it is when we're in an instrumental mode. We're trying to do stuff, achieve stuff. There's a goal in mind. We see ourselves as separate people, and the environment around us are there to help us achieve our goal. And that is important. That's a really important, you know, way of encountering the world. But also he talked about I and thou, which is where we connect with one another in mutuality. So we really sense a very deep interrelatedness, interconnection. We see how our gestures affect the other person and vice versa. We're more present moment and we experience change and flow. And his work really examined how do we, in his words, turn fully towards the other. And so I began to explore his work in particular in my doctorate. And ever since my doctorate, I've been still interested in that sort of experience of deep connectedness between people, and particularly why that can be so difficult in our often rather dysfunctional organizational settings.
You said something lovely there, just in terms of noticing how our gestures affect other people. And often when we think about attention, I think and even just how you kind of said initially, the focus is on me, I, and how I'm exploring myself and whatever it may be. But I think that there's something really, I think I heard something from Jiddu Krishnamurti before along the lines of, to have comes with freedom comes great responsibility, because you become essentially aware of the consequence of your actions. Just from your perspective, just that significance of that attention, like of really almost taking somebody in. How is that kind of, how have you, not only even in studying that, but in experiencing the practice of that, has that kind of altered some of, yeah, your experiences in terms of what you're talking about in terms of interdependence or interrelationality and things of that nature?
So, one of the chapters, I suppose, in my doctorate was around power and how we perceive power and status and authority and how that can get in between us. Um, and that kicked off a research project called Speaking Truth to Power with John Higgins, which is still kind of running. And the thing that came to mind when I heard you speaking is an interview that I refer to a lot because it was really quite profound, and that's with a wonderful man called Ian Wilkie, who is chairman and founder of an organization called 50 Million Voices, which seeks to support about 50 million adults across the globe who stammer. And so Ian stammers. And in our conversation, he said words to the effect of, Megan, how you're showing up right now affects my voice. So if you look really frustrated, or if you start looking at your watch, or if you're trying to multitask and do your emails, or if a frown goes across your face that looks like you're judging me negatively, he said, I'll literally lose my voice. And that just still strikes me to this day as one of the best metaphors of leadership. You know, how you show up affects the voices of people around you. It actually does more than that. It affects how they think as well. And it's as true at home as it is at work. And when you really sit with that thought, you know, how you show up is affecting the voices of people around you. That's a profound responsibility. And and really, I think, takes us towards the fact that, yeah, as we show up, we gesture, and that gesture is interpreted by another, and they respond accordingly. And this dance kind of continues between us. And sometimes that goes on without us realizing that we each have, in a way, the freedom of choice around the next gesture we're about to send. And if we're able to create a space where we can choose that response a little bit more wisely, our conversations could be very, very different. And our conversations are the things that, define our lives and the lives of people around us as well. So I think that interview with Ian and his wonderful way of describing his experience there was just a really brilliant metaphor generally for how we show up and the impact and the relatedness that we have with one another. If we would just pause and wonder and be fascinated with that long enough to notice it.
And I agree with you. That's just absolutely gorgeous. And it's interesting. I do so many of these interviews around this question, and I always wonder how it keeps going, because I'll hear something like you've just shared there that I haven't heard before, and I'm like, wow, do you know what I mean?
Mm,
Even just the pure humanness of that there, like, I think it's very hard to hear that and not be moved in
mm,
some way,
mm,
and also become acutely aware of the responsibility that we do hold to each other. In
mm,
terms of just you touched on briefly, like, the difficulty in kind of, whether it's in corporate culture or even just present day life, of our capacity to almost notice. When did you start to when did your interest start to even go specifically even to corporate spaces, or just the busyness of modern life, in terms of, I guess, noticing the conditions where it makes it even harder to kind of tap into some of these profound observations?
well, I guess it goes all the way back to my first job after I'd finished gallivanting around the world and still didn't know what I wanted to do. So I went into, I became a consultant, which is a great thing to do if you've not got any clue what you want to do. So I became a strategy consultant, and then we created beautiful strategies, and then wondered why they weren't necessarily being implemented. And of course, they're not being implemented because the beautiful strategy on paper hits people and all their wonderful ways of being. That means that they don't behave in, in an entirely predictable manner. So, after a few other corporate jobs in the wild west of the internet in the 90s, I definitely, just the bit that just fascinated me more than ever was the trickiness, actually, of getting people to work well together. In an internet company that I was part of, I was, without any experience whatsoever, found myself managing a big team that was partly in America and then in the UK and Germany. And, the cultural differences, the differences in how we could communicate, given that it was virtual, and this is back in the 90s, of course, which was before much was known about virtual working. Um, so that was the piece that really interested me, and all of the things that got in the way, the assumptions that we make about one another, the labels, the titles that we put on ourselves and others that distance us, the performative nature of what we have to do at work, the feeling that we need to be seen in a certain way. I mean, that haunted me, I think, without even really me noticing all certainly at the beginning of my career, the need to be seen as, hardworking or perfect or whatever it happened to be. And then I think again, it was when I did the doctorate work where I really started to explore, what does dialogue actually mean? How do we experience dialogue in its deepest sense? And I used a method called cooperative inquiry. So there was a group of us that met regularly over a period of, I don't know, was it a year or 2 years? And in that time, we were able to really put a sort of microscope under the space between us and say, well, pause, what's going on here? What's actually happening? And a lot of it was, I was the facilitator. I showed up feeling that I needed to make the meeting worthwhile, that it was my responsibility, that they'd all given their time. So I better do well, whatever on earth that meant. So there was a lot of kind of anxiety and labeling and assumptions. There was the perception that I was somehow the leader and therefore responsible for making various decisions. And then, of course, there was all the differences in status and authority in the group, um, due to who people were and where people had come from and what they said. And it was wonderful because we were able to be in an environment where we actually noticed it. And then we not only noticed it, we brought it up and had the most fantastic conversations about the murkiness that often is, unseen and unspoken about. So the thing that came out most from that is probably an interest in status and authority and labeling. If there's one thing that affects what gets said and who gets heard, it's our construction of status and authority. But it's also the one thing that we're least likely to talk about, ironically. So I have a fascination with that, and I have a fascination with our own sort of anxieties around how we're being seen and how we show up and how we fit and how we belong, and quite how much energy that takes us away from being present and meeting other people as well. So those sort of two fields I've been really engaged in over the last 10, 15 years, really.
It's incredible if you have experiences, and not like this is some permanent state, but if you have experiences, just like at the start when you mentioned, questions of how do I encounter the world, and if it's more self-focused or feeling separate, and then more, some of your inquiries into that connected flow state. And when you've experienced different states of that nature, it's incredible just how much the general ways in which we engage seem almost so problematic to deeper levels of connections.
Mm.
And you mentioned there that idea of showing up as, or almost creating an idea of ourselves in terms of how we assume we need to be seen.
Mm.
Like that's a really, there's a lot of heaviness to that, isn't there? Like there's
Mm.
a lot of like that comes with a lot of kind of, that takes a lot of energy just to wear that.
Completely, and so take my situation at the moment as a mum, with 15, 17-year olds going through school, and the impact that I have, and, the messages and that I give them about what's important, and whether I get hooked into a wider societal message that persists in saying exam grades equals success in life, which it clearly, absolutely, increasingly doesn't. But so there's these sort of the ways that we understand what it means to be successful. And in fact, relating back to your question, Mark, in terms of what's a good life, what's a successful life, what does it mean to achieve? God, we've got some really noxious stories about what matters and what achievement is in the world, and some of them start in education systems that persist in this sort of ranking and grading and memory regurgitation, more than they focus on our capacity to relate, to understand, to connect, to wonder, to be curious, to empathize. We've got the balance completely wrong. But before I go off on one on that. I can feel a rant beginning, so I'm reining myself in. But yeah, so there's all these messages as a mother. How should I mother? What's important here? Should I be pushing my girls to get particular grades, or should I be focusing on this, that, and the other? What do I do about phones? I feel like sometimes I feel like a really good mum. Other times I feel completely inept. Um, and the world has a perspective on what a good mum might look like. Similarly, in the workplace, what does good leadership look like? Good grief, we've got so many stories around that, and it's all going in quite an odd direction at the moment in terms of leaders as knowing answers, as dictating responses, as being in charge. All of this kind of rhetoric that means that a lot of us are showing up at work feeling understandably fairly anxious because we feel like we need to perform to that completely impossible level. So yes, that whole area of how we perform, the amount of energy that takes in our minds, uh, the fact that our attention goes on that rather than turns towards the other. That's a fascinating area for me.
Though, isn't it? I think it's kind of, I don't know, this wonderfully human. The way I think to be human is almost to hold not even many paradoxes, but just lenses that may not always be compatible, or
Mm,
potentially knowing something intellectually that we just will not implement
mm,
on a
mm.
lived experience of life. And even just the beautiful contrasts that these experiences can offer, like the sense of, well, I think I'm being a great mum, or for anyone, I think I'm being a great parent, and then to also experience the feeling of being completely lost, or floundering with the notion of what that could be. Like, I'm not saying that's your present situation, but just
Oh, it
for
totally is,
anyone, like.
Mark.
And
It's completely my present situation.
but, but also, I even know from my own experience of having stepped away from finance and doing lots of projects that I love, and almost been flabbergasted at times with how little I focused on the making money part, and seeing how I chart that at this point in life where it's becoming a more of a requirement again.
Mm.
And just that wonderful kind of simultaneous looking at myself of like, wow, I really respect what you're doing, and to like, yeah, but it's amazing how you've let this one part go, if you know what I mean.
Yeah.
So I think there's something kind of perfect in it, and even it touches on what I think you said too, the capacity in groups though to just to notice what's going on. Like, I think we have this idea all the time that to notice or to have attention will lead to some level of purity. Like, I think it will benefit us in the long term if we pay our life attention and we don't look away from what's here. And yet I can be completely present and pay attention and still say something that I may need to tend to, or to acknowledge at some point. And I just, when you describe that situation in amongst a team as well, just the capacity to just notice what's going on right now, and just noticing how many layers there could be to that, or how many different energies or experiences could be at play. I think sometimes we think that if we pay attention and that we are transparent with each other, that will lead to almost like a smoothness. But I think it just helps us feel more connected or belonging to the moment, rather than it will lead to utopia, if you get me.
Oh, absolutely. I also explored another project that came out of my doctorate was called the Mindful Leader, and I did this with Michael Chaskelson, and became very interested in mindfulness practice, how it links with leadership capacities. And in that work, we created a little model which was called the AIM model, and it just came to mind when I heard you speak there, Mark. And A stands for allowing, And allowing is that capacity that I think you're just referring to, when we kind of look out and we look at ourselves and we think, we're not doing that well here. But it's that sort of slight sense of humor where we can kind of go, you know what? Yeah, that's the that's going on at the moment. Yes, that is what is happening. It doesn't mean I might not want to change it, but here it is. Let me acknowledge it. Let me kind of smile a little bit about it. That's allowing. Inquiry is the I, and our capacity to be just then really interested. And M is meta awareness, this capacity to notice what we're thinking, feeling, sensing as we're doing it. And those three capacities are trainable. We can actually practice those. And if you take them together collectively, if you have this ability to be meta aware, inquire, allow what you find, what happens is you create a small space um, where you can choose a response more of the time rather than be reactive. So that project really looked at how do you develop those three capacities, either individually but also in our teams. And in our teams, how can we notice, okay, for example, things are bumpy and, oh, yes, we are judging one another. Let's just allow the fact that that will always happen because we're human beings. Now, let's get really interested in it and let's notice our thoughts, our assumptions, our feelings, our sensations that are relating to it. And then maybe we can pause and look at that. The thing that all of that also requires, though, is, as you mentioned, space. And that's my latest research into spaciousness, which says, well, unless we create the conditions where we can hold open space for noticing, inquiring, and dialogue, then, we're not going to be changing any habits anytime soon. And it's become, bizarrely, pretty much courageous to open up space and hold space inside what we call pathologically busy work systems. If you're the person that just says, could we just pause here for a second? It can be quite career limiting, interestingly, depending on the power and status that you have. So it's deeply connected to leadership for me. Leadership is in one way of looking at leadership influences the attention of people in an organization. And if people in an organization are in busy doing mode, what we call doing mode, tangible target, short-term busyness, holding open a space where people can pause and see the bigger picture can feel quite rebellious, actually, in a system that's really equating busyness and activity with success. But it's absolutely essential if we don't all end up as busy fools, essentially. So, how do we create space for ourselves so that we don't disappear into a busyness loop? And how in our teams and our organizations do we create spaces where we make wiser choices? Despite everything kind of being set up in that system to hurry up and grasp the next moment as quickly as possible. And that's, to me, utterly pressing, given the state of various things at the moment in the world. So, how do we create more space to look up, look around, take a deep breath, and make wiser choices?
And I'm going to choose the very lazy option here of just asking you to answer your own question there.
Damn.
How?
Oh
Because
no,
I'd
you want me to give an answer to that? Hell. Yeah. Um, there is a wonderfully humorous irony in this research on spaciousness, is that in the corporate world, people's first question tends to be, well, what exactly is space? Could you define it, please? And after I finished defining it, of course, it completely narrows down their perspective and experience of space in the first place. So that's a lovely irony. The second thing that usually happens is, well, what's the business case? Can you give me the business case for space? Can you prove to me that pausing helps? And again, these questions come from deep within what we call the doing mode. We have explored, and we try and meet people in their doing frenzy. So we are actually trying to answer the question, what do you have to do to create more space? And one thing we've done is we chosen an acronym which spells space, and the S looks. You can tell that I like acronyms. Uh, so the S is safety. So there's a lot of things that we can do to improve psychological safety. When we don't feel safe, you can forget about being in a spacious mode because we are anxious and our gaze narrows. Um, so there's a lot around psychological safety at work. P stands for people. So the people we surround ourselves with have an enormous impact on how we engage with the world and where we pay attention, and whether it's narrow or expansive. And we can't choose everybody that surrounds us, but we can invite people that are particularly good at helping us look up and look around and just take a deep breath. So in the workplace, perhaps they might be coaches or facilitators or mentors or just really good colleagues that manage to do that well. So that's people. A stands for attention. And as I referred to early, you can actually train attention. And given the fact that attention arguably defines our life more than anything else, the fact that we leave it up to chance is quite extraordinary. Nearly all of us leave it up to chance. So there's a lot of our work that links back to the mindfulness work, in terms of practice, but also things like what metrics do we have in our systems, because metrics force attention to certain things and away from other things. So how can we be a bit more choiceful about that? How do we create speed bumps? I got that from Rob's book on Do Pause. What speed bumps are possible that help wake us up in the middle of our busyness? And C stands for conflict, interestingly. And C, rather than sort of relational conflict, this is to do with dissonance. So, how do we encounter difference that wakes us up, where we suddenly go, oh, hang on a second, I was doing it this way and I didn't even realize? Um, and then E stands for environment. Physical environment has a huge impact on how we encounter the world and how we see ourselves in it. And again, we are remarkably uncreative in a work environment in terms of where we meet and the sort of environment that we put ourselves in. And I'm interested in the impact of going for walks, going outside in nature, changing environments of work conversations so that we're not sat in the glass goldfish bowl at work, or we're not sat just on Zoom or Teams. What happens if we walk and talk virtually or face to face? That has a big impact on whether we can pause and look around and make wiser choices. So that's very much work in progress, and we are really wanting to help people look at how they create more space, whilst acknowledging that this isn't a quick 5 top tips easy win. It's actually is an ontological question. How are we actually seeing the world? How do we encounter the world? Do we see the world as an instrumental path to meet particular goals, or are we seeing the world as a as intimately related and interdependent and flowing and emergent, and fascinating? If that is, I suppose, the kind of ultimate question.
You know, I'm reminded of a quote that's attributed to Einstein anyway, whether he said it or not. I can't recall if when I looked it up, but it was something along the lines of, the most fundamental decision you'll make in life is whether you see the world or the universe as a hostile or a friendly place.
Mm,
And when you talk there, like, it's one layer of this really to say, look at our addiction to busyness. You said use that lovely term there, busy fools, and almost our fear of the pause or the fear of the space that exists between various monologues or things happening. So I find it really interesting that it's, yes, some of it's almost on the tactical material level that it needs to be to meet people where they are, but underneath it really that's this fundamental sense of how do we what do we really think of this world or this life as such. And I
yeah.
think it's beautiful that it's both things simultaneously.
I mean, the interesting thing is, of course, and one of the best quotes we got in our research was somebody that said to us, "If you open up space, you let doubt in, and who wants that?"
Hmm.
If you open up space and we stop being addictively busy and focused on our to-do lists, of course, we're a hop, skip, and a jump away from asking some really quite deep questions like, what is it to have a good life? What are we here for? What does it mean to be human? What does a what does achievement look like? What do I regret doing? What do I need to change? Some of these questions, we just simply like, no, thank you very much. I'd rather get down to my number 5 on my to-do list because that's way too tricky. And particularly if we don't have sort of a companion to help us work through some of those questions, they can feel really terrifying to some people. So that's we are avoiding it marvelously at the moment, but to our downfall. Everything at work is about pace and AI. Don't fall behind, grab it whilst you can, be in front. How do you beat your competitors? How can we stay ahead? Um, even though even though we're making choices that don't make sense for us as human beings at all. And that's what worries me.
Isn't that though it's a beautiful consideration to have within this as to what occurs perhaps when we do have space. When you mentioned that, an experience of mine came to mind when I took a sabbatical to when I kind of left finance and took a sabbatical to Peru, whereas really I framed it as just having the space to find out what I'd like to do next. And there were times in that where I was just like, oh wow, as much as I was enjoying, meditations and different inquiries into whatever, I remember saying to my wife on a few occasions, having a full time job is amazing to get away from some of this.
Mm,
Even though it was my intention to explore some of these bigger questions, it can still
mm,
feel like a lot to hold until we get
mm,
some sort of, I guess, even comfort in the process of being confused or not knowing, or as you say, doubt.
mm, mm,
From your perspective, just that the two, because it's funny on just on one level, on the more tactical surface level, like a bit of space to think and to take our time and to be deliberate sounds just incredibly beneficial. And then with knowing that with that can also come some deeper inquiries, how do you kind of how do you see that? Is that inevitably messy? Are there ways in which we can help ourselves navigate that more gracefully is the word that's coming to mind, or what
mm.
comes up for you in that regard?
That's a good question. I think there's sort of, I suppose you could think of a kind of spectrum of spaces as well. There are and I think about personally, I've had months off before kids, um, where I had lots of opportunity to go to amazing environments and really think deeply about some of these questions. Um, since I've had kids, that's not happening, obviously. But I have managed a few sort of 5-day retreats, a couple of them. So that's sort of like smaller retreats, but still quite remarkable in terms of having space to slow down and just look up and look around again. And then, of course, there are the minute spaces that we can put in every day. And I'm reminded of some of the people that took part in our mindfulness research, talking about the moment that they put the key in the door when they come home at the end of a day. And, the difference between when we just charge in the door, having had a really crap day, and it takes, seconds before everybody in the house is in a foul mood because our emotions are utterly contagious and we've just laid them on everybody else, versus that, 5-second space where, as you put the key in the door, it serves as an anchor and trigger to ask yourself, okay, what am I about to take into this house? How do I want to show up? Minute space that's not going to answer the meaning of life for you, but it's going to create an awful lot of difference for the people, for you and for the people in the house. And actually, you're creating a little bit more space for people around you. So I'm interested in all these sorts of spaces and the role that they all play. We're not in a position, many of us, to be able to kind of go, right, I want to go off and go for a month's retreat or backpacking in wherever. But that doesn't mean that we can't do some longer pauses, and it certainly doesn't mean that the shorter pauses aren't ever so important for ourselves and for the people that are around us every day. And the second bit of your question, in terms of facing into some things, I think the people bit is really important. Who around us helps us to engage with these sorts of questions in a way that we can manage and cope with. And I think we've probably all got colleagues or friends or professional coaches or therapists or mentors that help us look at questions that we really need to look at and engage with them, but in a way that we feel safe enough to do so. So that the people aspect, who do we go to, is really vital question in particular.
Yeah, and there's, even if it were something I forgot to mention, even if it's on the deeper level, I think that has a, if we do ever, if it not trying to make some layers or hierarchy to this, but if one does get kind of comfortable with some of those bigger questions, even without an answer materializing, I think the depth that it allows us to go into our relationships is something extraordinary, really. So I do get the sense that even if someone encounters some of those confusion or fear at those depths, I think there's an incredible byproduct or influence on our relationships. But I agree with you so much in terms of just the micro pauses. And just how almost startling they can be. I mentioned to you before, I've ran these series of conversations called silent conversations, where even in corporate spaces, we might come in, kick off a conversation with a 10-minute silence, maybe even longer in some non-corporate spaces. But even just for people to realize almost what's theirs, or what's their, how am I actually showing up to this space right now before I've even engaged with anyone. There can be just even in short pockets, there can just be a beautiful almost inevitability to the self-awareness that a pause creates, that otherwise, we're just bouncing around like a pinball machine, from what's going on at home to what's going on at work to what's going on with a personal friend, to so many of these different things. And I don't know, there's something that, it almost sounds heretical in this day and age. Like the word pause, it almost sounds heretical
Mm,
but without it, it's quite clear to see the kind of madness that is playing out in front of us. And
mm.
just in terms of just the weight or the burnout levels, all of these different things, which I think, as you're pointing to, if we just have some space, how we're actually capable, we're far more resilient with some pauses.
I mean, our research report, which we published in January this year, is called Permission to Pause. And that phrase came up in our research quite a lot. People giving themselves permission to pause was a big one, and also having permission to pause within organizational settings, permission from particularly those that are more senior or colleagues. And isn't it just utterly absurd that it is normal practice for people to fly into meetings with clearly paying attention to other stuff, cameras off or phones on, or that's normal. But to ask people to all pause for 2 minutes at the beginning of a meeting and close their eyes or consider how they're showing up, that's regarded as weird in many systems. And I just think, I mean, how have we got this so back to front? It's hilarious. And I, before many of my teaching sessions, or certainly my research inquiry sessions, in many of them, I'll facilitate a pause at the beginning. But I will state, for some people, it'll be as normal as anything. It'll be a habitual practice. You'll love it. And for others, you'll just think this is really weird. And isn't that weird that you'll think it's weird? And it doesn't need to take long. It doesn't need you to close your eyes particularly or do anything strange. It is just simply getting you to notice where your attention is currently. And then preferably forming an intention for the meeting that's about to happen. How do I want to show up? How can I show up in a way that's really helpful for me and my colleagues? And just a small pause to do that can make a profound difference to what goes on. I just wish we'd do it more.
Yeah, but it's I just had an image of literally someone, whether it was down through the years being on a BlackBerry and then being on a smartphone and whatever else, and engaging thoroughly with that and glancing up as if they're part of the meeting. Like there's so many there's so many actions that we do that are such a, I don't want to sound too dramatic with the word violence, but a violence to the depth or the fragility or the subtlety of connection that's possible, versus, as you say, the idea that something else could be considered weird. It's kind of, it really is kind of staggering that that is a potential interpretation of what a pause might take. There's just what you said though earlier in terms of even just the connected flow of life. I think there's something really interesting in just terms of when you're talking about space or pause. I think though, like these give us moments, even if it's not something that someone is consciously aware of, but to notice more about the sense of connection that does exist between us, because I think that's quite a subtle perception that's with the level of kind of bombardment we're under in terms of all sorts of information and technology and everything else. It's really hard to perceive that, I find at times. But when we do create these spaces, there is something I think that just, you mentioned earlier having the right people around you. I was in conversation with someone recently who just takes a long time to say something, but not in some waffly way, but just there'll be pauses in between the words. And I feel it's like good for my nervous system being in that person's presence,
Mm.
just that it's not this rush or gush of words. And just intrigued from your perspective of, like, are there profound kind of realizations that you see people making, even if it's not the intent of an engagement, but just with greater pauses? What kind of effects are you seeing on what people notice in terms of just their interdependence or connections?
I think an important part of it is with seeing interconnections and relationships. It's displacing really our focus and attention that tends to be on ourselves. So it's helping us to look outside of ourselves. Um, and as we mentioned earlier, in organizational systems, we spend a lot of time thinking about ourselves. How do I show up? What are other people thinking of me? Am I about to say something? Will it sound sensible? Should I try and network with that person? A lot of this is very self-orientated, and very performative in nature. And some pauses, when we get shaken out of that self-focus, can be really, really interesting. I mean, this isn't organizational setting at all, but it keeps on popping up in my head, so I'll just mention it. I remember when I was backpacking all those many years ago. I remember I was with a very good friend, an old friend of mine in America, and she took me to see the Grand Canyon, and I'd never seen the Grand Canyon before. And I think we were engaged in a kind of heavy conversation or something. We must have been. I remember having my attention very much firmly on me and the topic that we were talking about. And she pulled the car into the side of the road, and she said, "Right, let's just walk over over that road and look over that viewpoint." And I remember being still very much stuck in whatever world I had been in. And then I looked up and I saw my first picture of the Grand Canyon. And I don't know which the viewpoint was, but it was utterly astonishing. I mean, my whole breath left me. I actually burst into tears from being so kind of focused on the small, on the self and this topic that we were talking about. In one single moment, I experienced being so small in a good way in comparison to this sight that I suddenly had. And it was that sort of it's one of the most wonderful wake up calls that I've had. Um, and when pauses can do that, and that's a rather an extreme one, perhaps, but it's when pauses remind us that we're not the center of the universe. And when pauses remind us to really look outwards. And as Buber said, turn towards the other, turn towards the environment that's around us. When we do that, oh my goodness, it can be such a relief not to be so focused on having to be a certain way and our sort of self-obsession as well. So yeah, that's something that pauses can hold. That's a potential that pauses can hold. And sometimes they can be very dramatic and other times perhaps a little smaller. But it's that shifting of attention outwards that is really, really, really valuable.
That's utterly beautiful, even to even to conveniently have the Grand Canyon as part of the imagery as well. It's kind of perfect, and it's so much that I think is becoming apparent through so many of these interviews that I am doing around this question. It's I think it's wonderful to suddenly have your own self inquiries, to start questioning your own behaviors, patterns, all of these things. But how tense it can be for that focus to always be in on ourselves, and how
Mm,
hard I think it is even to develop a healthy relationship and space with ourselves
yeah,
if that is continuously the focus, and just how, I don't know, naturally we kind of unfold or unwind some of that attention when our focus goes outward to other people, and that simultaneous acknowledgement of our tininess, but the significance of our connectedness. I think it's just beautiful.
yeah.
And I was really intrigued actually to ask you how, because you had mentioned it a couple of times, those experiences of travel had maybe influenced your work, and obviously that's a very profound example of it.
Yes, and absolutely. I think there's something about backpacking in my frame, which was the sort of the open exploration without an agenda, the not working to a timeline, not actually going away for long enough that I can find myself in a random little town in South America and find a really nice cafe and then sit down and go, oh, do you know what? I think we'll stay here a few days. That sort of Oh gosh, that freedom and openness is something I must admit I'm kind of slightly craving for again. But it puts into stark contrast how much of our lives are run on schedules, on the need to be at a place at a certain time and showing up in a certain way. You know, I've got to get the kids to school at a certain time, and otherwise it all goes wrong. And then I've got meetings in my diary, and I've got to achieve this deadline. All really important doing mode work. You know, we have to have those things to survive in life. I'm not dismissing them at all. But when they take over and we have no spacious mode, then we've extinguished life, to be honest, in my mind. I think it's Ian McGilchrist that I love his work, full stop. But I also love the fact that he says, what's the opposite of death? No, sorry, the opposite of life is not death, it's the machine. And I think that is there's something in that. You know, if we instrumentalize our life, if we permanently stay so busy to meet various random targets and metrics, and we lose the opportunity to turn our attention to others and the world around us, then I don't know that's not human. That's not living. And Buber's words, all real meeting, all life is real meeting, that those moments, those profound moments of connection are to me the moments that make my life, so how can we make sure that we keep some sense of balance in a world that's gone completely mad with tangible targets and metrics and doing?
That couldn't have resonated more with my experience. And as you were saying that, I was just kind of thinking that an image kind of came up that it's almost giving life itself space. And
Mm,
when we're not affording life that kind of space, just how contained or full or almost claustrophobic, or how
mm,
much repetition exists within that reduces our felt sense or capacity for greater life.
mm,
Megan, just over the course of this, opening up with that initial question of, how do I encounter the world around me? And, outline the kind of the self-focused and the instrumentalist view of life that one could have, but also there's the possibility for this connected sense of life, the interrelationships, and so much of it is dependent on the focus of our attention. You touch on beautiful also kind of sad elements of life, like the distance that we experience between ourselves, the need to be seen as, and the different ways in which we kind of almost get in the way of
mm,
that connection, or that flow. Then your focus is in terms of space, then, and the capacity to, and also just how, I guess, how hierarchy and things of this nature may also get in the way. But the more space that we can give our lives, and even more recently, just what you mentioned there around the capacity to not have an agenda, the freedom to move in this life, outside of what you could refer to as the machine, is so instrumental in potentially experiencing something quite different. So many things you've said in this conversation, I'll look forward to listening back to, but really, really intrigued to hear your response to the question, Megan, of what is a good life for you.
a good life is an inquiring, curious life. A good life is one where we notice and really kind of realize how connected we are with one another and the world that's around us. I'll probably leave it at that.
That that sounds absolutely more than enough. Megan, this has been a real joy speaking with you. As I mentioned, there's so many things that you've touched on that definitely will give me lots of cause for pause and reflection. And just to say a big thank you for joining us today on the What is a Good Life podcast.
Well, thank you, Mark. And we're actually recording this on a Monday morning. And I think this is, you know what? I think we should always start the week with a conversation and a pause that looks at what is a good life. You know, that might make quite a difference to many of us. So thank you for the invitation. It's been lovely.